The seam in high orbit didn't look like a wound. It looked like a door being installed. Aster Vale's cloud layer rippled as if something enormous pressed against it from above. On Dock 9's sky feed, the arc widened in slow increments, clean edges, steady geometry, until the black behind it showed stars that didn't belong to this angle of space. Lieutenant Mara Cade stood on the command deck with Elias Vance beside her, both of them watching the same impossible curve. "Size estimate?" Mara asked. A tech swallowed. "Too large for boarding apertures. Too stable to be incidental. It's infrastructure." Elias felt the tracker harmonic in the Kestrel Run's collar thrum like a second pulse. The ship was answering it, quietly, involuntarily. Ralph sat on the console and stared at the screen as if the door in orbit was a mouse hole he intended to solve personally. Mara's comm lit. "Frigate control to Colony Command. We are attempting seam suppression." Aster Vale's escort frigate fired first, measured, controlled bursts aimed at the seam's edge. The arc shivered, but it didn't collapse. It absorbed, redistributed, and held. Mara's jaw tightened. "They're bracing it." Elias exhaled through his nose. "Handlers." "Handlers," Mara agreed, and they brought tools big enough to change the system. On the surface, the colony shifted into shelter posture again. Civilians moved indoors. Drones patrolled streets. Patrol cutters repositioned like sharks. Human ones this time, circling a threat they couldn't quite bite. Jun stayed inside Mark and Claire's home with Mrs. Rowan, wrapped in blankets, watching the sky through a narrow window. He didn't run to Dock 9. He didn't try to be brave by stepping into danger. He did the new kind of brave, staying put, trusting the adults. Claire squeezed his shoulder. "You're safe here." Jun nodded, eyes wet. "I know." Back on Dock 9, Mara turned to Elias. "Your ship is still tagged." Elias didn't flinch. "I know. And every time that harmonic answers, it teaches them where we are." Elias glanced at Ralph. "And every time Ralph stops them, it teaches them how to adapt." Mara's eyes hardened, but her voice stayed calm. "Then we stop teaching. We close the lesson." Ralph yawned. Slow, massive, insulting. Mara watched him do it like she was watching a weapon being holstered. "We need a protocol," she said. "A repeatable method." "A way to break seams," Elias murmured. Mara nodded once. "Seambreaker protocol. And, Captain, whether we like it or not, your cat is the key." The orbital seam widened another fraction. Not rushing, not panicking. Building. The military called it a field lab. The colonists called it the cage. It was a reinforced hangar bay on Dock 9's underside, cleared of cargo and lined with portable dampeners. A ring of instruments hung from the ceiling like metallic vines, each tuned to the frequencies pulled from the claw signatures and the tracker harmonic. Elias stood at the threshold while technicians argued over calibration. Ralph sat inside the bay already, because Ralph went where Ralph pleased. Mara approached with a slim data pad. "We can't collapse the orbital seam with firepower alone," she said. "It's stabilized by handlers, but we observed something in Encounter 1 and 2. Elias didn't look away from the bay. "When they board, the suppression field wobbles." "Exactly," Mara said. "Shared reservoir, shared control. Their system strains when it has to manage seams and contact simultaneously." Elias's stomach tightened. "So we force strain." Mara's mouth flattened. "We create controlled seams at small scale, induced flickers, then test what disrupts them, safely, repeatably." Elias glanced at her. "You're saying we poke holes in space on purpose?" "Yes," Mara said. "With dampeners on, with kill switches, with med teams on standby." Elias exhaled. "And where does Ralph come in?" Mara tapped the pad. The predators respond to dominance cues, but the handlers respond to measurement and control. They treat Ralph like an anomaly. If Ralph's presence destabilizes their seam harmonics, if he introduces an unpredictable variable, then we can model that variable. Elias gave a humorless laugh. Model a cat. Mara didn't blink. Model a seam breaker. Inside the bay, a tech called out, "We have a flicker." A vertical shimmer formed in the air above a marked circle on the floor, thin, trembling. It didn't open fully, but it was enough to make every hair on Elias's arms lift. Ralph looked up at it. His ears angled forward. His body went still. The shimmer pulsed, then steadied for a half-second, like a door trying to decide whether to exist. Ralph stood and walked toward it with the slow certainty of an apex predator approaching a rival's scent. The shimmer wavered. A tech shouted, "It's desynchronizing!" The seam's edge frayed, then snapped shut with a soft pop that made instruments spike. Silence fell. Mara stared at the readouts. "Again," she said. They triggered a second induced flicker. This time it held longer. 2 seconds. 3. Ralph approached again, but instead of hissing, he yawned. The seam collapsed immediately, like it had been embarrassed. Elias felt a chill. That can't be coincidence. Mara's eyes were sharp. It's not. His presence is interfering with their stability, through dominance cues or biofield resonance or something we don't understand yet. But it's measurable. A technician looked up, pale. "Lieutenant, if we can scale this—" Mara finished the thought. "We can disrupt a handler-stabilized seam." Elias looked out through the bay's open hangar slit at the sky, where the orbital arc still widened. "Then we do it," he said. Ralph sat beneath the now quiet circle and began grooming his paw as if he'd just approved the project plan. Seambreaker protocol became 3 rules written on a whiteboard in Mara's office. Force a seam to open under controlled conditions. Introduce the Ralph variable at the seam edge. Inject a counterharmonic while the seam destabilizes. It sounded clinical. It wasn't. On day 2 of testing, the induced seam flicker opened wider than planned. A sliver of darkness appeared, and the bay's temperature dropped sharply, frost crawling along the floor markings like spilled milk. Ralph's fur rose. Elias stepped forward instinctively, pry bar in hand out of old habit. Mara's Marines leveled rifles that would do nothing to space itself, but humans pointed weapons anyway. It was how they told fear to sit down. The seam held. Something moved behind it. Not a predator. Not a handler. A shape like a sensor probe, thin, jointed, metallic, extended into the bay, paused, and withdrew as if tasting the air. "Auto-scout," Mara murmured. "They're sampling." The tech's fingers flew over controls. "Dampeners at max. Counterharmonic ready." Ralph walked toward the seam. The probe froze. Ralph stopped a pace away, tail low, and stared. The seam trembled. Elias felt the instrument spike. "Now!" he snapped. The tech hit the counterharmonic injection. A pulse ran through the bay, felt more than heard. The seam frayed at the edges like fabric tearing. The probe recoiled, snapping back into darkness. Then the seam collapsed with a violent shudder that knocked dust from overhead beams. For a moment, the hangar bay smelled like hot metal and ozone. Mara didn't move until the readouts stabilized. Then she turned to Elias, eyes hard. "They're scouting our method." Elias swallowed. "Which means they'll counter it." "They already are," Mara said. "So we need to deploy before they fully adapt." Elias thought of June and the quiet bravery of staying behind safe walls. He thought of the missing bodies that hadn't returned. He thought of the orbital seam widening like a patient mouth. "Where do we deploy?" he asked. Mara brought up a system map. The orbital seam has anchoring points, small stabilized nodes along the arc. We can't hit the whole door at once, but we can destabilize a node. If the node fails, the arc should ripple. Elias's gaze flicked to the Kestrel run on the screen. And the tag? Mara nodded. The tag is both problem and tool. It's the strongest carrier frequency we have into their corridor logic. We piggyback the counterharmonic through it. Elias's stomach tightened. So, we use my ship as the injection needle. Yes, Mara said, and Ralph is the destabilizer. Ralph hopped onto Mara's desk uninvited and sat on the printed protocol sheet like he owned it. Mara stared at him, then, against her own instincts, reached out and touched 2 fingers lightly to his forehead. Ralph tolerated it with dignified patience. You're not a mascot, Mara said quietly. You're leverage. Ralph blinked once. Outside the window, clouds shifted. The orbital seam brightened faintly at its edges, as if responding to the colony's attention. Elias exhaled. When do we move? Mara's answer was immediate. Tonight, before they finish building that door. The deployment team was small on purpose. Too many bodies meant too many variables, too much fear, too much noise. Elias, Mara, 2 Marines, 1 seam tech, and Ralph. The Kestrel run undocked under blackout conditions, slipping away from Dock 9's spine like a shadow trying not to be noticed. Her dampener collar hummed. Her patched engines purred with a restraint that felt like holding breath. Ralph sat on the captain's chair arm, eyes fixed forward, as if the canopy view were a hunting ground. June's sector is locked down, Mara said quietly on the bridge. Family network is under military shelter status. He's safe. Elias nodded without looking back. Good. It was the right kind of fade. Jun staying with people who wanted him, building a life that didn't orbit violence. The story moved on. He didn't have to bleed for it. The orbital seam dominated the sky now, an arc of wrongness spanning a chunk of cloud layer anchored by small stabilized nodes that flickered like cold stars. Node closest to us is at Vector 37, the seam tech reported. If we can destabilize it, the arc should ripple. And if it doesn't? Elias asked. Mara didn't sugarcoat it. Then we learn what they can take. The Kestrel approached slowly, keeping distance. The seam tech primed the injection system. Counterharmonic loaded into the tag frequency. The instruments glowed a soft red. Ralph stood. His fur rose along his spine. He stared at empty space near the canopy's edge. Contact, Mara said softly. She didn't need a sensor to see it. Handler presence. A thin, stable seam opened off the starboard bow, clean, deliberate. A handler stepped through onto nothing, then onto a small platform of field energy that held it in place. It carried a frame device, identical to the one seen during the convoy skirmish, but larger, built for orbital work. Behind it, predators hovered in the seam's shadow, ready but restrained. The handler didn't rush. It watched the Kestrel run with calm assessment. Elias felt the tag frequency spike, as if the ship recognized its architect. The handler raised a device and the Kestrel's systems dipped, not fully suppressed, but pinched, like someone testing a chokehold. Mara's hand tightened on her rifle. They're warning us. Elias leaned forward. Or inviting us. Ralph yawned. It was absurd in orbit, with a seam door growing in the sky and alien infrastructure crawling across reality. The handler's posture shifted, just a fraction, as if something in that yawn disrupted its confidence. The seam tech whispered, Captain, the node's stability just fluctuated. Elias felt adrenaline hit. Ralph is affecting it. Mara's eyes narrowed. Now, inject. The seam tech hit the sequence. The tag harmonic pulsed outward, carrying the counter-harmonic like poison on a familiar scent. For a heartbeat, the orbital node held. Then it wavered. The node's edge frayed. The ark's surface rippled like water struck by a stone. The handler reacted instantly, lifting its frame device, reinforcing the node, pouring control into it. Elias saw the opening. "They're spending," he snapped. "Push it." The seam tech increased injection amplitude. The Kestrel's dampener collar whined. Ralph stepped onto the console, placing himself directly between the canopy and the handler, eyes locked. The node trembled harder. The handler's calm cracked. It clicked, a sound like a command. Predators surged forward inside the seam shadow, not boarding, not attacking, forming a living shield around the node. Mara swore. "They're defending the infrastructure." Elias felt the ship shudder as the handler tried to reassert suppression. Systems flickered. Life support dipped 2%. Ralph growled, deep, vibrating, and the node's stability finally snapped. The anchored point collapsed like a punctured bubble. The orbital arc rippled violently. For a moment, the huge door in the sky shuddered as if it might tear itself apart. Then, it held. But it held weaker. Mara's voice was tight. "We didn't close it." Elias stared at the wavering arc. "We proved we can hurt it." Ralph sat down calmly. And the handler, still poised on its field platform, looked at Ralph like a problem it intended to solve permanently. The retaliation came as elegance. No swarm, no roar, no reckless charge. A second stable seam opened behind the Kestrel run. Too close, too clean. "Seam aft!" the seam tech shouted. Elias spun the ship, but there was no time. A suppression pinch hit the thrusters. The Kestrel's vector control lagged half a second. Half a second was enough. A device, small, dart-like, shot from the aft seam and struck the Kestrel run's dampener collar with a soft metallic thunk. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the collar's hum changed pitch. Elias's stomach dropped. "What did it do?" The seam tech's eyes went wide. "It's sinking. It's trying to overwrite our dampener profile." Mara's hand snapped to her mic. "Doc 9, this is Cade. They've tagged our collar. We need countermeasures. Now!" Doc 9 responded with urgent static and a clipped acknowledgement. But help was far away in orbit math. The handler at the bow raised its frame device again. The arc in the sky steadied slightly, as if reassured. Elias gritted his teeth. "They're learning our method live." "Then we deny them the data," Mara said, and her gaze snapped to the collar readouts. "Can we dump the collar?" Engineering's voice crackled over comms, strained. "Captain, dumping the collar means dropping half our shielding and risking a full suppression lock." Elias felt the trap closing. "If we keep it, they hijack it. If we drop it, we might die." Ralph stepped off the console and padded toward the bridge hatch, tail low. He stopped and looked back at Elias. Not pleading, pointing. Elias understood with a jolt. "Cargo bay!" Mara followed his gaze. "You want to isolate the collar system in the bay, use it as a decoy?" Elias nodded. "We can reroute collar control to a detachable pallet, shove it into the bay, and vent it. Let them hijack the wrong target." Engineering swore. "That's insane!" Elias snapped. "Do it!" They moved fast. Mara's Marines held positions. The seam tech rerouted control lines. Elias shoved open access panels with hands that shook only when there was no time to shake. Ralph paced beside them, ears angled toward the seams, tracking the handler's pressure like a predator tracks footfalls. In Cargo Bay 1, the collar control module was bolted to a pallet in minutes, cables patched like stitches. The hijack signal followed it greedily, as if drawn to the heart of the collar. Elias slammed the bay door. "Vent on my mark!" Mara's hand hovered over the control. "If they board..." They won't, Elias said. He wasn't sure why he believed it, but he did. They want clean data. They'll take the bait. The aft seam widened again. A predator shape appeared, then paused, head turning, sensing the rerouted signal. The predator clicked once, then withdrew. The seam folded shut. Mara exhaled sharply. They took it. Now, Elias said. Mara vented the bay. Pressure dropped. Frost webbed across the bay viewport. The pallet, collar module, and all jerked, then slammed into the bay's outer hatch and locked into the emergency eject rails. Elias hit the eject. The pallet shot into space, spinning slowly, broadcasting the hijacked collar profile like a beacon. The handler's aft seam opened again, and for a fraction, Elias saw a device latch onto the pallet. Confident, satisfied. Then the seam closed. The Kestrel Run's collar hum steadied. Mara's eyes were hard. We bought minutes. Elias stared at the orbital arc. It was still there. Wounded, not dead. Ralph sat in the bay threshold, looking up at the sky like he was already planning the next bite. Doc 9 didn't waste the minutes. The moment Elias reported the collar decoy, the escort frigate repositioned. Patrol cutters fanned into a wider net. Turrets on the spine turned upward, tracking the orbital arc's weakened node like it was a cracked tooth they intended to pull. Your disruption created instability, Doc 9 Command told Mara. We're going to hit the arc in the ripple window. Hold your position. Mara's reply was clipped. We are holding as long as we can. The handlers are adapting. Elias watched the arc shimmer. It was still growing, slower now, but deliberate. A door being reinforced after someone kicked it. The seam tech spoke quietly. Captain, the tag harmonic is pulsing again. It's calling. Elias's mouth went dry. Calling what? The answer came as another stable seam, opening closer than the last, right off the bow, like the handlers were closing distance without fear. 2 handlers stepped through this time. They moved in perfect coordination, devices syncing with the arc, with the residual claw signatures across the colony, with the tag frequency humming in Elias's hull. Predators hovered behind them, restrained, poised. Mara's Marines raised rifles. Elias tightened his grip on the pry bar as if it mattered in orbit. Ralph stood on the console, fur bristled, eyes locked on the closest handler. The handler lifted a device, and the ship's lights dimmed fractionally, testing a chokehold again. But this time, the pressure didn't feel blunt. It felt targeted. The seam tech's face went pale. They're not suppressing the ship, they're isolating one system, Elias snapped. Which one? The seam tech swallowed. Life support. Mara's eyes went hard. They're squeezing us without dropping our maneuvering. They want us conscious. Elias understood with cold clarity. They want Ralph alive. They want us alive enough to deliver him. Ralph growled. Deep. Vibrating. The ship's instruments spiked with odd interference. Tiny fluctuations that made the handler's seam edge shimmer. The handler paused, head tilting. Not fear, interest. It extended a thin device like a probe toward the canopy as if it wanted to sample Ralph again from a distance. Elias felt anger burn through the fear. No. He keyed the injection system. Tech, give me manual control of the counter-harmonic. The seam tech hesitated. Captain, if you overdrive it, do it, Elias snapped. Controls shifted. Elias felt the system respond like a live wire. Ralph's stare tightened on the probe. Elias pulsed the counter-harmonic. The probe's glow flickered. The handler's stable seam trembled for the first time. The arc in the sky rippled. Mara shouted, Frigate! Now! The escort frigate fired again, this time not at the arc's edge, But at the weakened node Elias had destabilized earlier. The shot hit with a compressive shock wave. The node shuddered. The arc buckled. For a heartbeat, the door looked like it might collapse entirely. The handlers reacted instantly, raising their frames, pouring stabilization into the node like engineers shoring up a collapsing wall. Elias saw it. Strain. Shared reservoir. The same wobble as Encounter 1. "Ralph," he whispered. Ralph hissed, sharp, precise, and stepped closer to the canopy. The nearest handler's seam edge frayed. Elias slammed the counter-harmonic again, timed to the hiss like a strike. The seam snapped shut violently, cutting the probe off mid-extension. The handler staggered half a step, first sign of something like frustration. Mara's voice was low and fierce. "That's it. That's the protocol." Elias stared at the rippling arc. "We can break seams." Mara didn't look away. "We can. But now they know it." The arc didn't close, but it stopped growing. For the first time since it appeared, the door hesitated. Doc 9's instruments recorded the change, micro-collapses along the arc's edge, forced repairs, stabilization surges, work being done under pressure. "We've stalled their construction," Command reported. "We're holding the system line." Mara didn't celebrate. "They'll shift tactics." Elias felt the words settle like lead. "To what?" Mara looked at the colony map on her pad, at the claw signatures still etched into pipes and vents. "They'll go groundside. Their infrastructure is everywhere now. They'll stop trying to build the door fast. They'll build it through us." Elias's jaw tightened. "And the missing?" Mara's eyes were grim. "Not dead, not confirmed, harvested, stored, something." The handlers withdrew slowly, not fleeing, not chased, simply stepping backward through stable seams that closed behind them like well-made shutters. Predators followed, orderly. Elias watched them go and felt the humiliation of Encounter 1 flip on its head. Humans had wounded their method. Now the aliens would respond with precision. Ralph sat, calm again, as if he'd already accepted that this wasn't a single battle. Mara turned to Elias. "We need to formalize it. A seam-breaker team. You, your ship, and—" Her eyes flicked to Ralph. "The variable." Elias let out a rough breath. "I didn't sign up to be a weapon." Mara's voice softened slightly, only slightly. "Neither did the colonists who disappeared." Elias looked away toward the clouds. Somewhere under that cloud cover, June was inside a warm home, held by people who wanted him. Elias clung to that image like a lifeline. Mara continued. "Jun stays off the board. He's in the safe sectors with the family network. He doesn't need to be part of this anymore." Elias nodded. "Good." Ralph stood and walked to the bridge hatch, then looked back at Elias, eyes steady. Elias understood the look. "You are part of it." Doc 9's alarm boards shifted from red to amber. The colony breathed again, cautiously. But the claw marks didn't disappear. The harmonic tag still pulsed. The orbital door still hung in the sky like a patient threat paused mid-swing. Mara spoke quietly, as if saying it softly might make it less true. "This was a skirmish." Elias stared at the arc. "And the war?" Mara met his gaze. "The war starts when they decide to stop testing." Ralph yawned, as if daring them to try. Night fell over Astor Vale, and the arc in the sky became visible to the naked eye. Faintly, like a scar across the stars. People stood on sheltered verandas and stared upward in silence. No one pointed. No one joked. The sky was a reminder now, not a ceiling. In Mark and Claire's home, Jun sat with a blanket around his shoulders, watching through the window. Mrs. Rowan sat beside him, her hand over his like an anchor. Claire's voice was gentle. "You're staying here, love. Tomorrow we'll work in the towers again." Jun nodded. His eyes were still wet, but his breathing was steadier than it had been during the first attack. He'd made a home inside fear, and that mattered. "I miss Ralph," Jun whispered. Mrs. Rowan squeezed his hand. "You can miss him and still stay safe." Jun swallowed. "I know." On Dock 9, Mara reviewed the day's logs and found a pattern that made her blood run cold. The handlers hadn't just responded to the seambreaker pulse, they had recorded it. Every time Elias injected the counter-harmonic, a matching echo appeared along the colony's claw-mark network, like someone copying notes from one instrument to another. "They're learning the protocol," the seam tech whispered. Mara's eyes narrowed. "Then we change it." Elias sat on the bridge of the Kestrel Run with Ralph in his lap. The cat's purr vibrated like a small engine against Elias's ribs. "How do you change a cat?" Elias muttered. Mara glanced at Ralph. "You don't. You change what you do with him." She tapped the screen. "If they're copying our pulses through the colony network, then we stop giving them clean pulses. We give them noise. We give them unpredictability. We make the Ralph variable impossible to model." Elias frowned. "You're talking about improvisation." Mara nodded. "Humans excel at it." Ralph blinked once as if approving the doctrine. A tech called from the command console. "Lieutenant, new seam activity." Mara turned. "Where?" The feed zoomed in on the arc. A small stabilized node blinked, then another, then a third, forming a subtle pattern along the door's edge. Elias's stomach dropped. "They're re-anchoring." "Yes," Mara said softly, "but slower and smarter." The handlers weren't trying to force the door open. They were building redundancy, making it resilient against seambreaker disruptions. Elias stared at the screen. "They're engineering around us." Mara's voice was tight. "That's what handlers do." Ralph's ears angled forward. He stared at the arc and his fur rose slightly, a quiet warning. Elias looked down at him. "You feel it, don't you?" Ralph yawned once, smaller this time, less mockery, more fatigue, as if even an apex predator could feel the scale of what was coming. Mara leaned forward. "Captain, we have one advantage. They want Ralph alive. They want him studied. That gives us leverage." Elias's jaw clenched. "It also paints a target." Mara's gaze didn't waver. "Then we stop being the target and start being the trap." Outside, the arc brightened faintly, not opening, preparing. The next morning, Dock 9 received a transmission. Not in human language, not even in pulse code. It arrived as a modulation in the tag harmonic, subtle shifts that the seam tech translated into meaning through pattern analysis and dread. "It's a signal," the tech said, voice shaking. "A structured message. Not words. Intent." Mara leaned in. "Give it to me." The tech swallowed. "It's a demand." Elias felt cold crawl up his spine. The message repeated in 3 beats. "Return the anomaly. Cease interference, or the harvest continues." Mara's face went still. "They're negotiating." Elias's laugh was harsh. "Threatening." "Both," Mara said. "They're acknowledging Ralph as leverage." Ralph, as if hearing his title, jumped onto the console and stared at the harmonic readout with calm disdain. Elias's hands clenched. "We don't trade him." Mara's voice was quiet, firm. "No, we don't." A second alert chimed. Outer system sensors. A faint distortion at the edge of detection, not a ship signature. Mara's eyes narrowed. "Seam transit." The arc in the sky flickered, just once, like an eyelid twitching. Elias stared at it. "They're moving something through." Dock 9's frigate repositioned, weapons ports opening. Patrol cutters spread, drones lifted. Mara spoke into her comm, voice like steel. All units, full readiness. Seam breaker team on standby. Elias looked down at Ralph. Looks like we're official now? Ralph blinked once, then yawned, bigger, confident again. Somewhere on the surface, Jun sat at the hydro tower window with Claire and watched the sky. He didn't run. He didn't chase Ralph. He held the blanket tighter and whispered a promise only he could hear. "Be safe," he murmured. On Dock 9, the seam tech stared at the Ark's node pattern. "Lieutenant, they're forming a new configuration. It's not just a door." Mara's voice went low. "What is it, then?" The tech swallowed. "It looks like a corridor anchor, a permanent gateway." Elias felt his mouth go dry. A war didn't start when the first shot was fired. A war started when someone built a bridge. Mara turned to Elias. "Encounter 4 ends here," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "We stalled them. We proved we can break seams, and now they're changing the rules." Elias stared at the sky door and felt the story's next shape forming. Bigger, darker, inevitable. Ralph sat on the console, tail wrapped neatly, watching the Ark as if it were prey he intended to outlast. And somewhere beyond the door, handlers worked in calm silence, adjusting their designs for the day they stopped testing and started taking. To be continued. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next story in the series. Subscribe to stay up to date with new releases.